executive director, like I can do a budget, a profit and loss statement. You know, those things I'm familiar with, but economic justice. And then I started thinking about and listening yesterday. It's me, right? So I come from a mixed family. So I'm Anishinaabe and Scandinavian. And so my dad is white and my mom is Anishinaabe. And we live in a very rural community. So I come to this enormous city. And the town I live in has 12,000 people. I don't lock my door. The big city I work in, that is a half-an-hour commute, is 86,000 people. So it is a small community. My tribal community is very rural. I live right off the reservation. And I think about how that has impacted my life. So I think, I gotta stop saying I think I know. That the first stories in my family that I carry is that my great-grandmother was sold as a house servant. And that's where she learned to cook. That's where she learned to do these things. You know, I got to know her. She passed when I was 15. And so I had a really close relationship with my grandma. Her name was Rose. And so looking at my family, we did not have much money. You know, my mom would always make meat soup, and we stopped asking what the meat was in the soup very early on. But that was just something, you know, that we did, and that was life. But we were rich in our connection to each other. Even now, I think my mom has texted me 100 times since I have been here, because she's very afraid for me to be in DC because of he who shall not be named. So I look at, you know, what I had and what I didn't have. I looked at how my family struggled and the people around me. And so I was going to be that person that went to college. So I was the first person in my family, went to Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College, sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes, scared out my mind to walk into that school. You know, but I did it. I went in there and experienced things. And this is where I entered the movement. So I was poor. Students in the tribal college, and he said, hey, my wife just became this director of a culturally specific program, and she's looking for college students to work overnight. It's a domestic violence shelter. He said, I think you'd be good at it. So he's from my community and knows that I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual exploitation. And so being from my community, you can't hide those things, right? We have like 5 people that live around you. Those things you just can't hide. And so I was going to school to be a high school English teacher. And I got into the shelter, and it was like, I liken it more to a spiritual calling than an active career choice that I met. When I could sit in community with other survivors, it is the only thing I wanted to do. I am not a high school English teacher. But I used to be very much so, not understanding the power I had in my own voice. I said, I used to be, Sarah, please don't be mad at me, Curtis. Sarah, please don't look at me, Curtis. because I didn't think my voice had any power or any meaning, or that there was no reason to put my voice out there. Hey, Tanya. And so as I started working in community with these women in the way that we do, and they started sharing their stories with me, and I started sharing my stories with them. And we started seeing things that were wrong. We started seeing things that were wrong beyond it being our fault. We started looking at how difficult it was to access financial assistance and housing. So housing is a problem everywhere, but in our small communities, women actually had to make the choice if they left the person in the relationship who chose to use violence. There are no homes to go to, like literally. There are no extra, there are no apartment buildings. There's no nothing. There's no, even if there were housing vouchers or Section 8, the housing stock doesn't exist. So they were actively making a choice to be homeless or coming and taking a break. A lot of women use the shelter as a break because you could be there 60 days and then have to return home. And so we started looking at and teaching each other laws. We started looking and teaching each other different ways of life. We started teaching each other handicraft. Like I've taught so many women how to crochet. If you know me, it's very surprising I don't have it here, but I crochet all the time. So I'm from Minnesota and it's cold. And you can't wear the same hat all the time. And so, and then as I was sitting with these women, coming back to myself, I would hear them say, I like the way you say that. You know, that sounds good. Let's do that. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? And then a very good friend of mine told me, for you to not share your gifts is stingy, and you are not a stingy person. Mm-hmm. And so then I had to think about that for a minute, right? And I thought, what kind of ancestor do I want to be, right? What kind of ancestor do I want my grandbabies to see and my great-grandbabies to see? Do I want to be the person who lets someone take my voice? Someone intimidate and hold my power for me? Or did I want to access the badass women around me, put my feet on the mother, right, and move forward? And so what helped for me in a we community, a community of we and not of me, is that my fight was not just for my own self. My fight was for my people, right? And everyone around me. Y'all are my people, my fight is for you. And so I started taking chances. And I don't know how or why or who made this decision, but I started running the statewide Tribal Domestic Violence Coalition, working with the 11 tribes in the state of Minnesota, working with MCPW, Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, and bringing speaking truth into the darkness. In my community, domestic and sexual violence is off the charts. There was an NIJ study, the National Institute of Justice, for Justice, one of those words. And, okay, thank you. And it said in there that 55% of Indigenous women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. That is more than 1 in 2. that is higher than 1 in 2. And I can tell you in my experience, so living my life, and also I've only humbly, but I've been doing this work for 15 years. And so being in those spaces, I have not met an Indigenous woman that has not been sexually assaulted. I have never. And I've also never met an Indigenous woman that has only been sexually assaulted once. Mm-hmm. The reality of the women I work with, we're talking 10, 20, or more times. That's the reality that we live with. And because of the invisibility in our tribal communities, people don't see that, right? And so my community decided, I'm the one, Kiwi Hayashi, let's go stir some shit up and go into the state, come to DC and speak. And so I would also organize community women, right? Because just because we didn't have Western academia, did not mean my folk are dumb. Did not mean my siblings were not intelligent in the movement. They just didn't have the language. And so we teach each other. We teach each other how to speak. We would teach each other. We would often stand together, right? Because you got some nerves. I got some nerves in here still. Jumping around a little bit. But you know, we have that space. I know Joy was right next to me. Joy was right next to me in this movement and started coming to the state. But what happened, and something there stuck out to me, it said, valuing a variety of skills and knowledge of being compensated for emotional labor. Woo, right? I was doing all of this, but I was only getting my paycheck, right? There was no extra money. And the Native women together, I mean, we do what we have to do. We say a loaf of bread and a ring of bread, bologna sandwiches, and coffee, and those kinds of things coming together. And the state began to access us more, asking me to come and speak when tribal community had issues where there was a lack of cultural understanding. I think of one very remote community. It's a community of 400 people right on the Canadian border. So right on Canada, you step 10 feet and you're in Canada. It's right there. And the lack of cultural understanding and the lack of education of the folks that worked on the state level, they almost shut the program down because they said they weren't serving enough, they couldn't hold enough staff. But it's a tourism. Folk come down from Canada and prey on folk in the tribal communities. There's a lot of violence there. And so I was able to, because I had stood strong in my voice in my community, work with that tribal community and work with the state to repair. And they kept their grant. Because oh, hell, fire and brimstone would have come down had they not. And I was at a meeting with the two state coalitions, so the Minnesota Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Coalition and the Tribal Coalition for Sexual Violence and My Tribal Coalition. And the folk at the table just went on and on and on and on about how much I had helped them, about how grateful they were for me, about how much they learned. And then they started a conversation around how much money they were giving to the coalitions out of their pass-through money. And it was a budget cut year. In Minnesota, things were tight. And so the conversation